Welcome to the Hot Topics podcast from MB Medical. Neal Tucker here as usual. And this is the next in our series of interviews where we talk to interesting and influential people from the sphere of general practice. And today I'm very lucky to be joined by Dr Helen Salisbury, who is a GP. She works actually very near where I live. Helen, you're not my GP because otherwise that could be slightly uncomfortable. Not for me, probably more for you, I suspect. But you, the audience, may well know her from her weekly column in the BMJ, which she's done for a number of years. I tried to figure out how long that was, Helen, and I couldn't.
Started December 2018, so it's quite a lot of years now.
That is quite a long time now. You may know her as a fierce advocate for general practice. She even stood as an MP in defence of the NHS a few years ago. I think she's had a very varied career. Good morning, Helen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, Neil.
Let's start with the questions then. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your career.
Well, a bit before general practice, I didn't do medicine to start with. I did a wonderful degree, which was philosophy, psychology and physiology. And I had a whale of a time. And then I decided I needed to do something useful and practical. So then I did medicine as a graduate entry medical student before that thing really existed. So there weren't any graduate entry courses. So I did medicine in London. And then I did a number of different jobs. It was before you had proper training schemes for things. You just kind of did jobs until somebody thought you were ready to be a consultant and you'd passed the relevant exams. So I did various medical exams thinking I would stay in hospital medicine, and specifically in neurology, which was my chosen specialty.
Someone's got to do it.
Absolutely. At some stage, I realised that this wasn't the right place for me. And then probably not coincidentally, I started a family and skipped to general practice at about the same time, which is a very common route. It's a huge relief to find that I was at last a round peg in a round hole.
And where did you start general practice? Where were you working at that point?
I started general practice in 19 Beaumont Street.
So that's notable just because, so I was a trainee in 19 Beaumont Street, which is a GP practice in the centre of Oxford. And then I worked there for several years.
Yes, well, that's where I did my training too. Because somebody said in those long distant days where it was totally relaxed, oh, I think we've got a space. Why don't you come and join us? So I did. So I did my GP training rather slowly, had to go back into a few other specialties because I'd only done medicine up to that, and ended up as a properly qualified GP around the turn of the last century, a long time ago. For the first sort of 18 years or so of my GP life, I combined GP with teaching. For quite a long time, I ran the communications course for the medical students here in Oxford, which was great fun. And towards the end of that time, I kind of thought, I'd really like to do some writing. Because I did a little bit of writing when I was a GP registrar for Pulse Journal. I did a column for them. And at the same time, an advert came up for doing a column in the BMJ. In retrospect, I moved seamlessly from a career that was clinical and teaching to one that was clinical and writing. In my practice, I'm at a practice called Observatory Medical Practice in the middle of Oxford, and I've been there since 2002, which is fabulous because I know all the patients.
And I get the impression from hearing you talk before and reading your blogs in the BMJ that that's a really big part of general practice for you. You're a partner at your practice, you're fully embedded within the practice, you get to know your patients and you know the local community really well over those 22 years. Yeah, okay, couldn't do the maths there. So it's quite interesting. You've got a really interesting insight into how general practice has evolved over a decent period of time here. So maybe then let's ask you, what do you think are the biggest changes that you've seen to general practice throughout the course of that career?
There's kind of what's changed in my practice and what's happened in the rest of general practice. Because I have to say, I am a signed up dinosaur. I carry on doing pretty much what I did. There are changes, but I'm not shifting. Probably much to the annoyance of some people. I feel the bedrock of of general practice and the thing that makes us efficient in the NHS and useful for our patients is the relationship on which that consultation is based. Not every consultation, but an awful lot of our consultations. I mean, there's space in there somewhere for transactional consultations where somebody just needs a pill for an ailment. They know what's wrong, they know what they need. Please come and have it. Here's your prescription. We can do that. But actually, most of medicine is not like that. And we all know that. And most of medicine is actually surprisingly built on this physical, psychological, social, it all messes up together. And as the GP, you're the person working out what's wrong medically, what else is playing into that, and what can you do to help the patient, which may not be ordering them a scan. Go back to your question, which is what's changed. On the whole, we've moved to working in much bigger units. Lots and lots of people were working in practices with 2 or 3 partners or even just on their own. And I think the average size, when I joined, we were an average practice. And I think we had 5,000 patients. We're now still an average practice and we've got 12,500 patients. I mean, there was a time when it was just a GP on their own and their usually wife as a receptionist. That was when general practice first started. By the time I joined, it was mostly a group of partners and maybe 1 or 2 nurses. And now we have so many other staff. We've become much more proactive and less reactive, which is probably why we're so incredibly busy. But on the way, we may have slightly lost our way or got ourselves drowned in so much work, in that we've taken on so many preventative agendas and have become sort of the technicians delivering cholesterol management and lots of other things. I'm not saying they shouldn't be done, but the thing we were first there for was responding to patients' illnesses and the things that were worrying them and the things that they experienced as symptoms. And now we've sort of had to have 2 focuses. It's not that wasn't there before, but I think it's much more to the fore than it was.
I'm always conscious, Helen, that having spent a long time working in central Oxford, that we are in a little bubble. Now, that's not to say that other people around the country won't be in the same kind of bubble necessarily. There are lots of people who work in inner city practices. I dare say that the centre of Oxford is a little bit different than the centre of Glasgow. I suppose one of the difficulties that general practices always faces when we're trying to think about change, when we're trying to think about challenges facing general practices, just the diversity of practices, the diversity of the populations that we're serving. Tell me a little bit about your practice.
My practice is in a very nice bit of Oxford. Kind of 2 generations of GPs before me. There were 2 lovely, lovely women who ran it. And one of the things that happened was that there was a big influx of Bangladeshi and Pakistani workers into Oxford at that stage. And lots of them registered with Dr. James and Dr. Bedford as they were, because they were women and they'd like their wives to be looked after by women. So we have historically quite a large Asian population still registered with us, even though they're now scattered across the city. But where we're actually located, which was once not really the centre of Oxford, we're just on the edge of Jericho. If anyone knows their Morse, the Dead of Jericho is set there. It was poor. It was really poor, and it was mostly council housing 30, 40 years ago. It's now very yuppified. It's now, all the housing that isn't council housing now is incredibly expensive. So we have quite a diverse population, but mostly they're well-educated and relatively well-off. That's not all of our patients, but it's most of them. We also live in a city that has a fabulous hospital and really, really good hospital services. It's struggling, everywhere's struggling, but we know we're relatively lucky. And it's one of the issues that I find a challenge when I'm speaking or writing about general practice, is that my experience is probably a lot less hard than most other GPs' experiences, because we have enough doctors, we have a good hospital. Yes, there are still, ridiculous 9 months waits to see a specialist, but there are specialists there and you can usually get an answer to communications. And our practice managed to have waits for routine appointments of less than a week, which is Not always, but at the moment that's how it is, which is I know completely different from where many patients and many GPs are at the moment. So when I'm writing, do read it with a pinch of salt, because I'm writing about what my experience is. And I know I'm an incredibly lucky GP.
We can all keep that in mind. I mean, I'm reading your columns. It seems to me that you do seem to have your finger on the pulse. I'm sure you're always talking to friends and colleagues around the country to give you an idea about what on earth is going on.
Yes, actually, at the moment I'm slightly in mourning, because I could no longer, in all conscience, be on Twitter. But I've lost some of my input, because it was a really, really good source of, what's everybody thinking out there. And Blue Sky hasn't quite stepped up. It's on its way.
Twitter's a very difficult thing. I'll be honest, I never really enjoyed social media. I found it a pit of despair, but maybe that was just always the people that I was following. I don't know, but not going to get into world politics here. But with Elon Musk currently trying to take over the world, I'm always surprised that so many people are still enjoying Twitter. Or maybe enjoy is not the right word. We'll leave Twitter aside for now, but what are the greatest challenges, do you think, that face general practice at the moment?
I think for many practices, one of the biggest challenges is just keeping the doors open. There is not enough money going into general practice for us to do our job properly and to hire the workforce that we need to do it. You talked a bit about changes earlier. We talked a bit about changes. One of the big changes that happened in 2004 was a change in the GP contract. Before that, history lesson here, there was something called the basic practice allowance, which meant that if a partner retired, you lost a whole chunk of income until you had another GP partner. So there was a really big incentive to keep your number of doctors up. The 2004 contract allowed salaried GPs, which did several things. One, it introduced kind of 2 tiers of GPs, which I think was a bad idea. I didn't like the inequality and hierarchy that brought. The second thing it did was mean that you could keep looking around to find out who could do this work more cheaply than a GP. And that's kind of where we've ended up now in its extreme. The number of actually employed GPs has gone down and down and down, either as partners or as employees, as salaried doctors. And the number of other people working in general practice has gone up and up. The 2019 introduction of primary care networks ramped this up massively with the introduction of the additional roles reimbursement scheme. The idea was that these would be additional roles in addition to the general practitioners that you had. But actually, even in the original specifications they were drawn, they were replacement roles, because pretty much for all of them, they had to be having patient-facing roles. So you couldn't just have a pharmacist come and join you to do backroom staff. I mean, I'm really, really delighted to have pharmacists working with us. It's fantastic. You get a discharge summary for the hospital, then somebody else reconciles the drugs and makes sure that all the prescription changes that should happen have happened and sorts out the dossier box. Wonderful. I'm really, really pleased not to do that. But to be at ARS, certainly in the original contract, they had to be doing some patient-facing work too. They had to be doing some consulting. And the same applied to pretty much all the additional roles. So they were taking on patient-facing work, which GPs had previously done. This has quite a few consequences. That it decreases continuity. It introduces inefficiency. You may say, and I'm sure you'd be right to say, there's just too much work for doctors to be doing all of it. But I think we've possibly gone too far in the opposite direction. A patient who might have seen me for an appointment which definitely went beyond its allotted span, but talked about their sore knee, and I would, in the meanwhile, just do a quick medication review and check their blood pressure, tinker with their antihypertensives, have a long conversation about their alcohol consumption, because that may be why their drugs weren't working, in the context of the bereavement they've just suffered. And we'll also have a look at the knee and work out what needs to be done for that. If I'm not doing that, they probably seen the HCA to have their blood pressure checked, and the pharmacist for a medication review, and the physiotherapist to see about their knee, and also then come to me to talk about their bereavement And maybe no one talks about the alcohol at all. I don't know. We do a lot more activity and there are lots of other staff working, but have we actually achieved more? Very sceptical.
I would echo that. I feel like the figures are showing that general practice is doing the most it's ever done. And yet I don't necessarily feel that the outcomes that I'm seeing in practices where I'm working is actually any better. And I would certainly agree with the idea about inefficiency.
There are problems that stop us doing the things we want to do because we don't have enough doctors and we don't have enough money. And I absolutely get that. But we also don't necessarily have the mindset that continuity is really, really, really important. I was teaching some registrars in the hospital recently about continuity, and there were two people working in different practices, both of which had, you can only book on the day systems. But one of the practices assigned you to your own doctor, your named doctor, if they were there that day. And the other one just did it taxi rank style. And it's kind of, well, you've got the same number of doctors and the same number of appointments. Why would you not be aiming for continuity? Because it's so much more efficient if you already know the patient. And similarly, in our practice, where we have personalised lists, patients are free to go and see whoever they want to see, but they're encouraged to see their own doctor. You have a list of patients that you are responsible for, and you're responsible for making sure their reviews happen, and you're responsible for all the letters that come in about them and their medications requests and their results. And actually, when abnormal results hit your inbox, if you have a mental image of who that patient is and why you ordered the test, very, very much easier to know whether minor abnormalities are just fine or whether actually you need to start getting worried. And if you're doing somebody else's work, it's just so much harder and more time consuming. I can't understand why anyone would not be trying to maximize continuity, because it makes the job so much easier and it makes it so much more fun.
Now, you've been writing for the BMJ for quite a few years then. I think people might be quite interested. How did you get involved in writing in the BMJ in the first place?
The way it happened was I saw an advert on Twitter and it said, could you be the new Margaret McCartney? And I thought, well, that's a bit of chutzpah from me, but maybe I could.
Those are pretty big boots to fill.
They were very big boots to fill. And I'd have to say that, I'm not Margaret McCartney. She has this fantastic evidence-based medicine brain, which is really not where I am. We've got different things to talk about. But nevertheless, she was the column that I read. If I opened my BMJ, that's what I read. So I thought, yeah, I could give it a go. So then I got in touch with the email that was there and said, I'm going on holiday tomorrow. So when is it that you're thinking of, is there a deadline? And they said, well, we've got quite a few entrants already. So as soon as possible. So I had to sit down and write something there and then. And the only application was a piece of writing, 450 words. Go.
Good to know that you can put together a blog in a short space of time, because otherwise it could become a very time-consuming part of your week.
Absolutely. And I think the things that got me the job were, A, I'd clearly done it in a hurry and it was okay. And B, I had previously written, many years before, I wrote a GP registrar's diary for Pulse magazine when that was, I think, a weekly or fortnightly publication. So they knew that I could deliver, because I think there are lots of people who can write really, really well and probably write better than me. But it's that, yes, I will produce you copy on a weekly basis. It's now gone fortnightly.
Pressure's off a little bit.
Pressure's off a little bit.
What I like about the column, Helen, is that you're clearly, you spend time highlighting the challenges in general practice that we're all facing. And one of the great things about having that column in the BMJ is, perhaps unlike this podcast, which is listened to almost exclusively by people who are working in general practice, when your column goes into the BMJ, actually that's not just going to like-minded people, that's going out to the whole medical community. So you're actually kind of sharing a little bit about the problems that general practice is facing to all medics out there, which I think is quite advantageous, because as we all know on a daily basis at work, most people don't know what we do most of the time.
No. Absolutely. And sometimes it goes even wider than that. I also have a secret weapon, which is my sister, who is my first editor. So she's a wordsmith, but she's not medical at all. But she looks at my writing and doesn't usually alter very much, but will swap around clauses to make sure and will tell me when it's not clear, and will tell me when I'm using words which are not generally understood. And sometimes I'll say, yeah, but all medics will get that, I'm keeping it. And sometimes I think I could probably say that more simply. And it's that thing about clarity and making it accessible to a wide audience while not dumbing down, which is what I work on.
Do you find it difficult to think of something new every week?
When I first started, I had so many bees in my bonnet that it took quite a lot of columns to quiet that lot. And then I had to start getting new ones. There was a lot to write about during COVID because so much was done so badly. There's nearly always some daft political initiative that you need to comment on. And when all else fails, I just go back to the consulting room.
I get the impression that sometimes you're coming to your columns from quite a political perspective, and obviously you've been quite politically active in the past. Are you still politically active?
The kind of national stage politics. I was asked in, I think, back end of 2015, whether I would join an outfit called the National Health Action Party and stand for Parliament. And I thought, why not? So I did. And it was enormously good fun, actually. It was great to actually take part in that democratic endeavour. I had no chance of ever winning a seat, but I did stand twice. I stood once for my local constituency, which was Conservative, and once when Cameron stood down in Witney after the disastrous Brexit vote. It was very, very interesting. In fact, the person who did get in, not when I stood, but in the next time of our local one is now our local MP, and who is now chair of the Health Select Committee. So I've made some good friends through that as well. And in terms of the British Medical Association, that was a relatively new venture. I've been involved for coming up for 2 years with the BMA, and I kind of went in feet first, joining BMA Council, getting elected to BMA Council, I guess because people knew my name. And I guess the thing that I've contributed most while I've been there is getting involved in the whole debate about physician associates, which has been quite hard work. I think just such an enormous mess. I feel terribly, terribly sorry for the people who've taken on that career, having been sold something that was impossible.
Let's come to our last question then, Helen, which is the same thing that I've asked everyone on these interviews so far. What's your ideal vision of general practice? And I guess what I mean by this is not so much what you think general practice needs to be, really what you would like general practice to be. And maybe following on from that, do you think that we've already had that? Do you think we've lost it? And if neither of those things, do you think we'll ever achieve it?
Ideal general practice. Well, I think if you look back at what I consider the halcyon days of general practice when I first joined, you would find that lots of people were doing lots of complaining then. So there's always problems. Nobody realises they're living the idyll while they're in it, at least very few. I think we need to go to a situation where we have more GPs and each GP can have a smaller number of patients that they're responsible for. And that will need more funding and more GPs. My ideal GP day doesn't extend to 8 p.m, which is what most of my GP days do, but finish at a reasonable time with time within the day to do the work that you need to do. It involves, obviously, continuity, knowing those patients, mostly seeing those patients. And I think it involves a mix of, this is where I differ from Claire Fuller and her vision, it involves a mix of acute stuff and long-term conditions. And you're seeing the patients about the minor things and the major things. You get to know families. The only way you get to know families is because you see their kids with things that are probably nothing but maybe something, and they get to learn to trust you. And then you see the same people when they're grumpy adolescents, or they've got anorexia, or they've got symptoms of ADHD, or whatever else it is, and they already know you. That whole thing about long-term relationships, and long-term relationships are not built up by only doing the serious medicine. They're about doing everything, about being general, about being a general medical practitioner.
Do you think we can get there?
I don't know.
No, I was going to say, well, we should end on a high note, but we might be getting close to reality.
I think there's a lot we can do, even within the resources we have, if we think that continuity is a really important thing. I think there's also one of the things I value most about my practice is the relationships within the practice, and that takes a bit of investment of time, that we do sit down and have our coffee and sandwiches at lunchtime together, working among friends, which is really important to make you want to go to work.
And that is a great place to end. The idea about being able to spend your working lives with people that you like. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Dr. Helen Salisbury.
Nice to meet you, Neil.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the interview there with Helen Salisbury. Really interesting person to chat to. We'll be back with the regular podcast in 2 weeks' time with the latest in research relevant to us in general practice. Don't forget to check out the mbmedical.com website with everything that's going on from MB Medical Education. And until next time, take care. Bye-bye.